Now, my next guest, Stephen Lande, is an American commercial lawyer and former senior US trade negotiator whose work has broadened from the EU, the Caribbean, and Latin America to include Africa. Mr. Lande is the president of Manchester Trade Limited, a firm that assists the US and African governments to develop investment and trade strategies. He's established a reputation as one of the great international commercial lawyers of today. But even though his work has focused on trade and commerce, he's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, and he lectures widely in Africa, Latin America, Europe, and Asia. And of late, he's used that expertise to analyze and comment on contemporary political and social phenomena, including the rise of Africa in the modern day and how the continent and the US might shape their relationship to mutual benefit. And Stephen Lande joins me now on the line from Washington. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Lande, for joining us. How might Nigeria's CPC designation affect US-Nigeria trade flows in the short and medium term?
Well, first of all, let me thank you for the nice words you used to describe me. I'm going to let many other people listen to that nice compliments you gave. So I thank you very much. It is always a pleasure to be with the intellectual center of Africa, which is what I consider Nigeria. A lot of talk, a lot of discussion, and now we have to get down to action, which this is about, and so on. I think we are a long way from the sanctions unless this issue is poorly handled. I think the announcement is what gets the attention. I think President Trump does not mind attention. As you know, President Trump had staked out in his second term the desire to be basically a peacemaker and deal with, quote, persecution, problem people face, things that result in violence. You know, he feels he has helped resolve 8 political crises in the world. He also has a political base which has a very strong evangelical component or religious component and so on to that particular base, Christian religious component. And that, of course, may also be in his motivation. When looking at President Trump, you have to remember that he also prides himself as being, quote, a negotiator. He is not interested in taking any particular action. He wants to prove that his intervention has helped solve a problem. So the way I would look at this problem is first say, what the heck does the president want? What does he want Nigeria to do? There seems to be 2 different thought processes. One has to do with the Boko Haram, the religious fanatics that are involved in the problems up north and so on, etc. Is enough being done to control them? Are they focusing on Christians more in terms of defense? Then the second question, which appears to be a little bit of Senator Cruz's view, is, are the Nigerian government themselves, particularly with a northern president, with a northern dominated government, for want of a better expression, and maybe I should say, I'm not even sure northern, but I think Tinubu may come from the south, but with a Muslim-dominated government, are they participating in, quote, religious, I don't use your persecution, that's a strong word, but we'll say in pro-Muslim, anti-Christians kind of things and so on. So there are 2 separate issues involved. I would say that before looking at sanctions, even though your question is right on, I would look on what the provisions say. And what the provisions said, once you're a country of particular concern, that's what you were designated at. It says that in questions of religious, because that's what countries of political concern. So in case of a situation where you're concerned about religion, the idea is to come to an agreement, an understanding that you will, quote, alleviate the problem, and so on. Not necessarily resolve it, but take steps to alleviate or make progress in that area. Obviously, that involves diplomacy and negotiation. Obviously, for that to begin, there has to be some understanding of how this dialogue is going to be carried out. Right. So my suggestion is that although the sanctions are there, The objective of the exercise, including President Trump, is not to impose the sanctions, but is to show progress in a problem which is not easily defined and which many people don't think exists or are
Right.
surprised about it. So that would be kind of my reaction and so on. Yes, the US can harm Nigeria with sanctions. The Nigerians can take countermeasures. After all, there's China now, when they
Right. Well,
discuss
I
about the
want
value of
to.
the dollar, China.
Right. I don't mean to interrupt you, but I want to sort of pick you up on that because that's quite an important point you just made. I mean, you were talking about if the US imposes sanctions or curtails aid, how best the Nigerians, or what your advice would be to the Nigerians about how to respond. I mean, for example, I mean, might these current tensions have an impact, for example, on Nigeria's access to international capital markets, which could in turn affect this country's foreign exchange reserves, currency stability at a very delicate time in the Nigerian economy? And you were talking about the Chinese. I mean, might Chinese investments in Nigeria be a viable alternative if US-Nigeria trade deteriorates? If so, what strings do you think China might attach?
Well, again, you put your questions together, and I'm always trying to separate them. So the way I understand your questions, which are right on the mark, which are correct questions, are one, what is the impact of the fact that they've been put on the list? Not any action, but you seem to question that. Then the second question is, what can be the impact if any action is taken? And so on. And then what can be the reaction if any action is taken? So I was trying to respond and say the initial situation is what exists today. From what I understand, and I don't want to become an instant monetary expert, is the Naira is already under pressure. This is not going to help the Naira much, and so on, as far as being under pressure. Will it be that immediate impact? Well, I'm not going to predict the foreign exchange markets. In fact, there may be movement in the last 2 days, but I will say that the world gets used to these threats pretty quickly, and the world does not fall apart. And so on. Just look at the tariff example. It did lead to a lot of negative feeling originally, but now the stock market's at record highs. The US has a bunch of sanctions to put into effect against a number of countries. Duties appear to be coming down, but the world absorbs them. So at this moment, and given the fact that Nigeria is not as dependent on the US economy as other countries are, and so on, etc., a very small percentage of your exports go to the United States and so on. Oil, as you know, is a fungible item, so if more goes one place, it goes less in other places. But it seems to be replaceable. The price of oil basically has been trending down recently and so on. So I do not see much of an immediate impact in terms of Nigeria. As far as the sanctions go, that's when you come in and say, how much really can the US sanction a particular country? And how much can you sanction them when you have China sitting next door, Russia sitting next door, being willing to substitute, take steps? So the first question that came up in my mind is, since China is trying to promote the use of the yuan more than the dollar, and has some success, particularly in trade contracts with countries and so on, will this be a way that will go? If the dollar's under pressure, can Nigeria perhaps get some relief from dealing in the yuan? I mean, can they put their debt? Can they sell oil in yuan? I don't know. I don't want to go again over my head, but to simply say that if the US starts taking action, there's other actions that will be taken at the other side. I can come up with some good examples of what happens and how the issues move. Let me just mention Ethiopia pretty quickly, that because of a violation of a trade rule having to do with the program you mentioned, the African Growth and Opportunity Act and so on, Ethiopia was removed from the list of eligible countries about 2 or 3 years ago. Ethiopia's immediate reaction was to switch to other markets. They had a thriving garment industry exporting to the States. They now export more to Europe. They were able to also increase much more reliant on the BRIC countries. They became a member of the BRICS. So what do I read in the newspaper last week? I read that Export-Import Bank has carried out a very large investment program relating to the construction of Ethiopian airports that they're building, etc. That's moving, in the positive direction. I read now that Ethiopia is opening up the largest, I think the largest dam in Africa. I'm not positive, I think so, and so on. Egypt is sitting there very concerned because it could result in the Nile moving in other directions. The US is trying to pacify the two sides. So I honestly believe that this emphasis on sanctions, not the effect of the threat, but their imposition, is way ahead of time. There will be reactions taken. No one can predict what they will. Nigeria is better able to resist it than other countries where 30-40% of its exports go to the US and so on. You mentioned US aid. Well, we all know that US aid is no longer there. Military aid, it would be an interesting situation if the US pulled out and Russia pulled in, as occurred in some French African countries. So my real answer to your second question is idle speculation. There are so many things that can happen, so many reactions that can happen.
Right, okay.
There's a much better chance we'll come to a solution first than sanctions will be seriously imposed.
Right. Well, talking about those solutions, as we assess the diplomatic steps that you think would de-escalate tensions whilst protecting Nigeria's sovereignty, because at the moment there's a lot of talk about military intervention, attacks, against sort of Nigeria and all the rest of it. Do you think regional bodies such as ECOWAS or the African Union might be a good way to kind of mediate, or should Nigeria prioritize bilateral engagement?
Well, again, you keep making life sound like it's a choice. It's not a choice. You go down, you can, they used to have an expression, they're able to walk and chew gum at the same time. Yes, you go down all those routes and you see which routes happen to hold or not. Whoever thought that in the Congolese dispute, for example, that's going on between Congo and Rwanda, that all of a sudden Qatar is playing such a principal role in terms of trying to bring a solution to play and so on, etc. We'll see how Gaza goes, but President Trump's forming an international, or is working to form an international force to take over the Gaza Strip soon. And you look at the countries that are involved in that and so on. All of a sudden, Indonesia or Pakistan get involved. So I would simply say that it's hard to predict whether or not you should use the African Union or ECOWAS, but I would certainly explore that route. West Africa, Nigeria has been a founder of ECOWAS. They've been the major supporter of ECOWAS, particularly the fact that some of the French countries have left ECOWAS. I'm not sure that the Nigerians are going. I think the Nigerians might listen to ECOWAS a little bit, but they want it to work and so on.
Right.
But I keep saying to you that I understand your questions. I have no problem with them. They're legit. But to me, the question I'm asking is, what is the basis of the solution? If you do an agreement on this question of religion, and it's divided into these two issues. I do not believe, but please, I don't want to speak for Nigeria. You got to speak for Nigeria, at least you can reflect their views. I don't think the Nigerians would mind assistance in terms of fighting the rebels and so on, and fighting the insurrection, or whatever word you want to use to describe Boko Haram and its allies and so on. I think if that's the focus of the work, which obviously is, because that group is anti-Muslim, anti-Christian, certainly is on the list of people, of groups that countries of particular concern should be interested in. So I think the way I come at it is say, okay, now, if you get in this question of naming governors, of trying to choose which states may have Muslim governors who may be taking negative measures against Christians, whether you move about whether the military is adequately protecting Christians, this becomes a much harder issue. And frankly, I would love to answer it, but I'm not that much of an expert in terms of religious feuding within Nigeria. So I don't want to go there.
Well,
but I will
we
say
have to move on.
That's a different set of issues, and that's a harder issue because that does involve intervention, does involve concern about internal affairs.
Right.
But if it turns out to be a joint effort against terrorism, I think that may turn out to be a very positive outcome.
Okay. Stephen Lande, who's an American commercial lawyer, former senior US trade negotiator and president of Manchester Trade Limited. Thank you very much indeed. And he was talking to me on the line there from Washington.